While we're filling the room, I want to again thank our premier sponsors that are listed depending upon how you have your Zoom set up, speaker mode or gallery or whatever, but I have it in front of me. Hopefully you have it in front of you, our premier sponsors. They're paying us to have this prominent display, so hopefully you guys are seeing this prominent display. I'll read them real quick. CASA, New Jersey ARM, Provident Bank, Investors Bank, Moody's Investor Service, TD Bank, Prime Point, Lincoln Financial, and Edmunds GovTech. Okay, there's your commercial. Let's go on to the presentation. Welcome everybody to our last session. I told our speaker that for him, it's very fortunate that this is a virtual presentation. We've got about double our typical Friday registration, and we don't have people leaving the back of the room to get their rooms checked out and everything else. So we have a very attentive audience, a very large audience for, once again, another very relevant topic, labor and financial impacts of working from home. We have quite a few people using that right now. I'm in my dining room as we speak, as I'm sure most of us are doing this from home. So Jim Przanowski, how'd I do?
Right.
See, I gotta ski too, so at least I can come close. I'd like to thank Jim for giving us this presentation, and it's all yours.
Well, thank you very much. Just to give a little bit of background, I am a labor and employment attorney. We represent management in my office in Morristown. We do a lot of work with governmental entities. We represent municipalities, counties, public authorities. So when a lot of the events were taking place in March, where a number of businesses were closing down, we were working with our clients to try and figure out exactly how it was they were going to remain open and how we were going to operate with the with employees, albeit not necessarily coming in. Some were coming in, some we were having to work with them being out of the office. So a number of the items that we cover is really some of the battle plans that we ended up having to put into place on the fly during the March, April, May time period that we're looking at. And now that we've had an opportunity to kind of understand and experience what it is that has taken place so far with remote working, some being able to do it, some not being able to do it, some being able to do a little bit of hybrid, we're able to start doing a little bit of an assessment of, all right, what is it going to look like moving forward into the future? And one of the large pieces that I used as an assumption with this is we're going to assume that if people are coming into the office, we can do it safely and without any health issues that are going to be there, right? So, so the question, if we're back into another situation like we were in March, where all non-essential activity is going to be at home, then that's one piece of the puzzle. I still think a lot of these criteria that we're going to go over would still apply to it and maybe a little more easy to apply. But I think some of the items that we want to look at is first, to what extent should we be working at home? And obviously that assumption itself is contingent on, if I'm bringing people into the office, that can be done safely. So let me throw my screen share up so that you can see the presentation itself. And you can see that, everyone? So
yep, we can see it, thanks.
Yep. So I would say, the first question we want to ask is, to what extent should employees be working remotely, right? Because it's not something that necessarily fits in neatly with everything. If we look at the private sector, I think we can break down a number of the areas and start analyzing to what extent it makes sense. If you're in the knowledge industry, are you in manufacturing? Are you in technology? Are you in professional services? Who has to be hands-on and who is going to be able to work remotely, on a big scale? If we look to take a 30,000 foot view first, which of those industries, would be able to operate remotely? Obviously, manufacturing, you need employees to come in and be on the manufacturing floor. Many of the professional services, for instance, you may have some work that can be done remotely. You may have some work that needs to be in the office. For instance, a doctor often likely needs to be in the office seeing patients. You can't do that from home. But then even within those categories, we start looking at what does each of the what are the duties of the employee for the company, and to what extent can those jobs be performed on a remote basis, or do we need somebody to come into the office to perform the work? And then once we've identified the people, the industries, the people that can work within the outside of the office, what equipment do we need to make sure that they have access to? And largely, to what extent is the employer responsible for ensuring that that equipment is available to the employee to be able to work from home? And then finally, in this kind of segment of what I want to go over is, how do we measure productivity? How do we ensure that when somebody's not coming into the office, they are actually performing at the standard and the level that we need them to perform at? And we're going to have self-assurance that we're actually getting the productivity, because if productivity goes down, then that becomes a significant problem for the business, in that my largest cost, especially in a service sector business, is probably labor. And if labor is not producing, then that becomes a major cost, because I'm not getting the bang for the buck on the salaries and such that I'm paying out. So those are really kind of the first 4 questions that I ask when I've got clients coming in to say, how should we do the remote work activities? And a lot of this will dovetail back into government, because it fits into a number of these areas simultaneously. So first, we ask, all right, what is the industry that we're in? As I mentioned, the knowledge industry. So lawyers, accountants, financial advisors, people who have, say, a bachelor's degree, people who are maybe 5 years of experience in the field, and largely are working on what I'll call brain power, right? So, we're looking for them to have ideas and you'll be able to relay that information out to others based upon their knowledge, and training would be a knowledge industry. So a number of those people, they probably have a low level of items that they actually need to work remotely from. It's usually going to be a computer, a telephone. Maybe they need some access to some databases or something to the like to be able to perform. So that's actually an easy one to be able to operate out of. But then if it starts getting a little bit more difficult, you get into retail and manufacturing, for instance. So if I'm a retail store, I need professionals to come in and assist with the customers who are hopefully coming in. If I'm a manufacturing plant, I need to have employees coming in, feet on the ground, working in the facility to be able to produce whatever widgets I happen to be producing. And one that I mentioned earlier that could be a hybrid is professional services. So doctors, dentists may fall into that, where some of the work I can do outside of the office, say telemedicine. A number of doctors can do follow-up calls with the telemedicine. But a dentist is going to have a hard time cleaning anybody's teeth from over a computer. Although maybe some of us would like to have the dentist be able to work through the computer so we don't have to go to their office all the time. So those are areas where you may have a professional that is providing services, but they really are hands-on individuals that need to be able to operate, in the office and bring in the client to the office to be able to work with them. So um, the government sector falls into maybe all of these categories, right? For different divisions and departments. So it actually makes it a little bit more difficult for governments to start figuring out, can we work remotely or not? Because there's no one size fits all component to it. Obviously we have, collection of taxes. We have administrative people performing, maybe not that specific task, but similar ones. We have individuals that are out on the road, our DPWs, they're providing road work. They're plowing the roads and during the snowstorms, fixing water mains, things of that nature. We also have social services. Maybe they're working with clients. They're having to bring them in on a regular basis, meeting face to face. Maybe some of that can be done over the phone. Depends on, a lot of that could depend on whether the client can even go to a place that would be safe for them to be able to speak to social services. So that can become a little bit of a difficulty point of figuring out, is that something that can work remotely? Public health nurses, there may be a lot of paperwork that they can do outside of the office, but then there may be a lot of work that they need to come into the office and be able to perform at the same time. And meet with people and actually physically be present. Building inspectors, similar, and then police and fire probably can never work from home. So we run the gamut of people who are purely administrative, people who are 100% coming into the office, and then some that are maybe a little bit of a hybrid. So in deciding which of these areas you're going to allow remote work to happen, you're going to have to, be specific and parse them out for the individual tasks that they have to determine which makes sense and which doesn't. And within that, we would want to then say, all right, these are areas that first can be worked remotely. Then what are the employee duties that would allow for it? For instance, you may have an administrative person in the DPW who's handling a lot of paperwork. So just because DPW is a general area that you're not going to work from remotely with, that particular person, maybe they can work remotely. Or some of my clients have busing operations that they're able to, send buses out to pick up some of the clients that they service. Maybe the dispatchers from that unit can work from home and work remotely. Or maybe the technology isn't there for that. 911 dispatchers may be another one, depending on what the equipment necessities are. So they're working in public safety, but maybe they can, depending on what the criteria are, maybe they're able to work remotely sometimes or not at all. So we see a couple of examples of, where you need to do the individual analysis of what each person is doing, not just put it into the blanket categories of nobody from DPW can work remotely, nobody from the police and fire can, or conversely, not everybody from the administrative side may be able to work remotely. So most of the administrators maybe can, but maybe you need somebody who's in the mailroom, who's collecting mail, going to the copier and the scanner, sending information out to those who are working remotely, so they have the product that they can work on from there that's coming in on a regular basis. So, everybody's individual duties needs to be evaluated and determined to what extent does this make sense for us. And as I mentioned before, maybe there's some criteria that precludes it, even though on a big scale, you're going to be able to work from home, but there are facts and circumstances that are going to prevent it. I think the social worker, in theory would be able to work from home. However, they're accessing HIPAA protected material. Can we allow them to access that material from a remote location, or is that going to violate some of the security protocols that we need to put into place? We don't want them in a position where they can download it from the database that maybe they can access remotely that's protected and encrypted, and put it on their home computer, where maybe you have a breach of that system that could result in release of protected health information. Or a social worker needs to ensure that their clients have a confidential and private place that they're going to be able to speak to the social worker. If their clients can't find a spot like that, maybe they need to come into the office. Maybe you need to look at it as much more of a retail type situation where you need to speak with the social worker directly. So even as we look at the various positions, you need to really drive down into the granules to figure out, is there some roadblock that we have, and to what extent can we get over that to allow for the benefits of this. So once we've identified who can work there, then the question becomes, well, what equipment do they need? Now, again, the knowledge industry, maybe it's very simple. They need a computer, they need a phone, they need a Wi-Fi connection, they need cell service. Very simple. But then there's others, say in the financial industry, they were looking at trying to figure out, how do I get Bloomberg terminals into everybody's homes that they're going to be able to utilize? It's a very big, expensive piece of equipment. It's not that big, I guess, but it is still fairly expensive to make sure all the connections are there. Do the employees have the internet capabilities of handling the added service coming in, so on and so forth. And then, back to my social services and public health nurse example, is there a database that they have to be able to access, that they can do it from another location and not have to come into the office to be able to access it? So you're looking at a number of pieces to figure out, is there something that they're utilizing that wouldn't necessarily yield itself to working in a remote situation. But then once we send them out, now they're at home working, have all of the employees updated their computers so that they can work with today's technology. Does somebody still have a 5-7-year-old computer sitting at home because they don't really use it all that much? They're using their phone, they're using their iPad. Before we went to remote work, they didn't really open up the desktop all that often. It wasn't a prime consideration for what they needed in terms of equipment upgrades. How strong is the internet connection? It may not even be the employee's choice to have a high-speed internet or not. The internet providers have been working extremely hard to upgrade these systems, and a lot of times the log jam is going on outside of the home in some of the hubs, because now everybody's pulling from the internet at a bigger level than what they necessarily expected. The internet companies weren't expecting all of the students to be working from home and having to pull in the video. Video uses a lot of bandwidth with the internet and can slow everything down, especially in a neighborhood that hasn't necessarily upgraded all of its services. And it's going to take some time for these businesses, Xfinity, Verizon, and the like, to be able to catch up with the service demands. How good is the cell service? I was with a client yesterday and my cell phone was, not working at all up in that area. I have a co-counsel on a case. We can never get onto a conference call because his cell service is terrible in the area that he lives, and it's very difficult for him to have consistent routine cell service. How are these things going to impact the ability of somebody to be able to perform work remotely if they don't have just the general utilities that are necessary for it? And then finally, this is much more on the business end, the entity end. Do we have the capabilities of them logging into our computer system on a secure line that's not going to open us up to cybersecurity issues? And if not, what would it take for us to install that and have the ports for everybody that's out there? One of the big items that a number of businesses had when we first opened up is they didn't have enough VPN ports to get everybody onto their servers. Because everybody was coming in, they didn't need them. So a lot of the IT companies were having to expand the VPN protocols and abilities that a number of businesses had early on, because when all the employees left, they needed access to their computers to get in. But as we're looking at the overall components of all of this, you have to ask yourself, what is the overall cost, not necessarily to the business, but to the employee to be able to do this? A major piece of efficiency of an employee working remotely is that they need to have a dedicated space to be able to work out of. Deutsche Bank did a study not that long ago, and their takeaway was if somebody's sitting on their couch working with the TV on, efficiency is going to fall. The three biggest hindrances to remote working is the couch, the TV, and the refrigerator. So if employees have dedicated space that they can sit down, work on their computer, be separated from the kids that are doing schoolwork and the like, then they're going to be effective and efficient. The other thing that came out of the Deutsche Bank analysis was it costs well over $10,000 on the employee side to really set it up and put that into place effectively. Now, I don't know what all went into that number. I don't know if that was the equipment, if that was building space out, if that was just setting it up. That was just their conclusion that you're looking at a $12,000 cost that's going to fall into making sure that these spaces are separate and isolated so that you have maximum productivity. I think another area where you need to stay focused is we need employee collaboration, right? So business is a team sport. And even though we look at, say, a knowledge industry, I know that I, for one, spend a great deal of time walking across the hall, going to my partner and bouncing ideas off of him and getting feedback. And, he comes into my office with a number of issues that come up to discuss, various cases that we're working on. So while, it seems like we work in a silo, we're often, very much talking to one another on a regular basis. So it's important to have the tools in place. Zoom has been helpful. MS Teams, Slack have been other protocols that have been put into place to help us work our way through these items to get through it and be able to collaborate effectively and efficiently, and not necessarily blow up your email box at the same time. So putting some of these new tools in place can have a cost and a component, which also may go back to how old is the computer that the employee is using? Does it have the capabilities of putting these new programs on, running them effectively and efficiently, and does it have the processing power to be able to manage all of the different applications all at the same time? But how do we measure employee productivity for remote work? Again, I think that this is one of the most important components of what it is that we're looking to do. If the employees are not generating the work as effectively and efficiently when they're working from home, maybe because of the couch, because of the TV, because of the refrigerator, not having dedicated space, not having equipment that is up to par to be able to do it. It can be because the kids are interacting with them because they don't understand social studies, something of that nature, then that becomes a hindrance to getting the work done and has a huge cost component to it that we're going to need to address. So I always recommend let's identify for each position with specificity objective measures for an employee that they're going to be measured against. Attorneys, accountants, we have billable hours, so we can look to a big line item and say, are your hours equal to or more than what they were before we started working remotely? Have they fallen off precipitously? And if so, why? As we're working our way through it, I don't think we had a lot of objective measures initially when we were putting this together, but as we continue, and I think we will have remote works sometime into the future, right? It's going to be here for some duration. We look at each of the positions and we put these objective measures in. We notify the employees, this is what you're being measured against. So make sure that make sure that you're conscientious of how this is operating. But I always caution, what is measured is done. So if we put specific measures in place that only measure certain components of the work, you're going to see that gets done, and you want to make sure that other areas that maybe are a little less easy, more difficult to measure, are still getting done as well. So it's important to recognize the limitation that the objective measures have and still make sure that all of the work that's needed is getting done. And this puts a significant obligation on management to oversee the employees and assess the objective measures and make sure that they're communicating with the employees. This is what I'm seeing. Let's make sure that we're meeting the necessary criteria. But I think that, I think that it's important to underscore that we're hearing a lot of reports that productivity is up. Everybody's working more and they're harder and they're getting more done because they're working remotely. I challenge that conclusion. And that's why I say that we need to have the objective measures and be diligent on making sure that that's taking place. So what we've seen is a lot of contradictory material. If we go back to 2004, and it's almost become cliche, Marissa Mayer came in as CEO of Yahoo and said, in the big tech giant, no more remote work. Everybody's coming back here. And she had concerns with the culture loss that existed because of the remote work. And she wanted to see productivity increase because of water cooler talk, seeing somebody in the hall, bouncing ideas off of them, letting that natural flow of creativity, working with people happen again. This may be a little bit of a dated example, but I don't think it's a case study that should be disregarded, right? Because you had a tech giant at the time. It had all of the technology then that it was going to be able to utilize, and at the end of the day, you had a CEO who came in with other mandates, by the way, who said, I need everybody in the office. We're going to start working here. I think I said 2004. She was brought in 2012. We have now fast forwarded 9 years from then. We have different capabilities. We have high-speed internet. We have, other tools at our disposal. But I do think that it becomes a cautionary tale. And I don't know that one side of the pendulum is necessarily the right one for either. I don't know that it's necessarily everybody in all the time or everybody out all the time is necessarily the right point. It's a matter of managing the balance. And the Harvard Business Review just last month released a study saying, no, we are in fact more productive, the knowledge industry in particular. And they defined it as I described it earlier: bachelor's degree, 5 years full-time work experience, and use of brain power to determine information and provide their judgment as to what they're doing. What this study showed was that we're being pulled into meetings less, we're interacting with people less that are distraction. We're getting 50% more of our own personal choice of activities done. We're able to triage our work more effectively, and we're getting a significant increase in what we're doing. I think one of the things that doesn't necessarily get pointed out in this is you're reducing commute times, and that may have a significant benefit. I think me anecdotally, even though I only live about 30 minutes from my office, when I was working from home, I did feel as though I was a little more energized, and I think the lack of commute had a significant component of that piece. So I think that is something that is worth considering as well. And here's just a breakout of the graph of what they saw. They actually did this study back in 2013, and they were able to compare it to 2020 to draw their conclusions on it. And certainly their takeaway was, yes, in this particular industry, we're getting more productivity, and we should encourage the remote work on a more frequent basis. However, JP Morgan just recently announced, we want everybody back to work. What they saw, and this really doesn't surprise me when you put it out there, Mondays and Fridays, productivity fell off significantly. Their takeaway was the younger workers are not working on those bookend days or extending their weekends. We're missing onboarding, we're missing culture, we're missing learning opportunities, in particular for these individuals that are out there. So we really need to be careful as to put broad strokes as to whether this is a good idea or a bad idea. And, you know, I've spoken to a number of individuals running private companies and businesses and government entities and said, you know, maybe you need to look at the hybrid, you know, pick and choose what days people are going to come in, what days they're not going to come in, and make sure that we assess on the objective measures what we're going to be able to have them do and not have them do. And the more that we're getting the positive result on our objective measures, the more likely we're going to, you know, keep allowing them to work remotely on a greater basis. Those who are the most productive, you know, we're going to allow them to work full-time out of the office. The least productive, maybe we're bringing them into the office on a much greater scale. And again, I think we need to look at how do we measure productivity, right? So does technology allow us to measure some of that? I don't know the technology all that well. People that I do know say there's significant limitations to using technology in this manner, but I do also know managers who have used technology of this nature and very much liked being able to interact with employees remotely through it. So we can see when do they log in, when do they log out, how much computer activity is there, active computer activity going on, sending emails, receiving emails. You know, there can be reasons why a computer is not active, obviously. I do a lot of reading. I won't be active on my computer at that particular point. So my computer wouldn't necessarily be logging me working, even though I might be. You know, are there points in the day or the week, Mondays, Fridays, around lunchtime, early in the day, late in the day, that we're seeing slowdowns in these? And the technology may be able to give us some feedback to figuring out, you know, where are we getting productivity? Where are we losing productivity?
Jim, wait, takeaways. All right.
Yep.
Slide.
So, so kind of in short, you know, these are the items that we need to look at to try and figure out, does it make sense for us to even be doing this? And for those that we do it with, I know that time is getting a little short. We'll go through some of the highlights of what we need to look for and be conscientious of to ensure that we're in compliance. So did you want to jump in?
All right, we'll do the poll question. In the last discussion provided by the 2020 GFOA, is this the last discussion? All right, if anyone gets this wrong, you get no credit. So we just need to jump in with this, so it's not like the last thing we do. We're not short on time. We've got up to 15 minutes. Of course, there's time at the end for question and answer if you're not able to fill it. Dave Miller responds that he wants more. So for Dave, we will hold this open for an extra hour, but for the rest of us, we're going to 20. All right, back to this session. I apologize for the interruption.
No, it's okay. So the next question becomes, what are the labor and financial costs that we're going to have? You know, we've already touched on some of them and we won't belabor those points. To what extent, you know, are we monitoring the employees? What is the cost of loss of work? You know, what are the costs associated with the equipment? You know, how are we monitoring the hours, so forth, and making sure that people are accountable for the work. But one of the big ones that we're going to touch on is how do we make sure that people are getting paid properly and that we're staying in compliance with our wage and hour obligations. So one of the big ones that keeps me up at night is, are we complying with our overtime obligations? My fear in people working remotely is now we've put all of their emails onto their phone, onto their home computer, and they are going to start checking their emails a little bit earlier in the day, a little bit later at night to clean things up. If you're an overtime eligible employee, a non-exempt employee, then that is work, and that is compensable time that they're on. And we need to make sure that they understand that they need to log their hours when they're doing that, and put in for the time. If we do not want them doing it, we need to make sure there's policies and procedures in place to tell them that they shouldn't be doing that, and make sure that that stops immediately, because there is significant cost and legal implications to it. The Department of Labor is putting notices out saying that we as employers need to be semi-diligent in this. Does an employer have actual or constructive knowledge? Do they actually know it? Or should they actually know that the employees are working beyond the scheduled hours that they have, and providing work that is a benefit to the employer, whether you asked for it or not? So, you take an extreme example. In Germany, they've actually put protocols in place that say you may not email your employees before 7 and after 5. And so their technology systems preclude emails from being delivered to the equivalent of their overtime eligible employees outside of the 7 to 5 time range. I don't know that we need to go quite to that extent, but there certainly are managers who, if they see that their employees are responding to emails during the day, or after hours rather, they're going to take advantage of the benefit, and they're going to continue working later in the day. But that is time that needs to be compensated, and failure to do so has significant legal implications to it. So if a manager does have interactions with their employees after the time period, after their 8-hour day, after their 40-hour week, that's constructive knowledge. If they're just looking at their emails and not responding to anything, just trying to get a sense of what's in there, we don't know about it, they're not reporting it, it's harder for us to have constructive knowledge of that. But we do need to have policies in place that say, look, you need to log the time. We need to create a culture of logging the time, and a culture of, this is acceptable, this is unacceptable. Getting a big overtime bill that we weren't expecting is not necessarily beneficial to maintaining appropriate budget. So we want written logs, daily logs that they're providing. If we're ever in an overtime legal situation, an employee is provided written logs. Those are absent the employer having something to the contrary, having record keeping. The employee's logs, whether right or wrong, are going to be the driving force of it. So we want them to have written logs that they provide to us, and we rely upon those. Again, is there software that can help us do this? One of the areas that may be a little more difficult is, what if I'm working a little bit earlier in the morning? I work from 6 to 9. Then I take a break to work with my kids until about 2 in the afternoon. And then I work, the balance of the day from 2 later into the day. Maybe they're checking emails in the middle of the day, figuring out what schedules look like and how these are going to, the record keeping is going to operate within that schedule. May need to be done on an individual basis with the various employees. For the individuals that are salaried, we want to make sure that we continue with the criteria that allow them to remain salary basis. They are making sufficient amount of money. They're earning the same amount of money regardless of quantity and quality of work, and their duties are such that they continue with the exemption. Really, are they overseeing sufficient number of people? Do they have sufficient independence? Are some of those duties being reduced because everybody's working remotely? I would think that in most cases they're not, but as we are rearranging where some of the duties fit nicely, there may be some modifications to that could impact the salary status of some of our employees. But again, what about the equipment costs? You know, who's responsible for upgrading the home computer? Who's responsible for paying for the added software if there's a cost to that? Where are we, you know, what about a faster internet connection? So this is one that I don't know that's been given a lot of thought. I think we've all been reliant upon the employee has sufficient equipment because it's commonplace for people to have a home computer at home. Albeit I had a number of people that I interacted with, they really didn't have a home computer. The iPad, iPhone was sufficient to get them through a lot of the work. But when you're doing a Word document, the iPad has limitations. And I always like to look at California as our cautionary tale, because California always has an example of something that we're going to scratch our head on. So California actually has a law that says employers must reimburse California employees all necessary business expenditures or losses incurred as a direct consequence of the discharge of their duties, whatever that means. So, so it becomes, what are the necessary and reasonable costs that an employee is incurring to be able to perform their work remotely? We'll look at a couple of quick examples. I don't want to delve too far into California, but I think this is something that can help guide us. So employer wants to have specific video conferencing platform used. There's a cost associated with it. The employer is going to have to bear that cost, right? We need to upgrade to a premium account of things. The employer is going to bear that cost. Specific apps, things of that nature. But what if the employee needs a new computer or a new printer? Well, what's the reasonable component of it? The $3,000 computer, maybe the employer doesn't need to do the entire cost on that, but maybe there's a component of that that they're going to say, this is a reasonable amount. A computer that would be sufficient for our purposes would cost $1,000. I'll give you $1,000 toward whatever computer you want to use. Or printer, you know, a $300 printer would be sufficient. I'm not going to spend the $700 you want for that printer. I'll give you a stipend up to that amount to be able to do it. In New Jersey, there's no specific mandate for reimbursing costs, but as California goes, New Jersey often goes as well. So that's why I bring up California. As we continue to push outward away from the office and into our home offices, I think we need to be mindful of there could be mandates put onto us that we're going to have to start reimbursing these costs. And for what it's worth, California is not the only state that has this reasonable cost requirement. Illinois and others also have it. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see it in New Jersey at some point. I don't follow all of the legislation going through Trenton. I don't know of anything that's on the horizon, but I would anticipate this may be something that comes up in the near future. So what I would suggest is, you know, what we look at is putting policies in place to figure out what are we going to be doing and implementing this. So, so what are we doing for the Wi-Fi? What are we doing for smartphones, landlines? Identify the areas where the entity may be able to reimburse, or it makes sense for the entity to reimburse because there's a benefit they're going to draw from it, and be able to you know, justify the expense and put reasonable cost measures on it. To the extent that the employee is incurring these costs, we need to make sure that there's not going to be some, it's not going to be a cost that's then going to put them below the federal and state minimum wages. So if they're itemizing, you know, an increased cost in their internet service, for instance, you know, that monthly service, you know, what is that, you know, aggregated out over the course of a pay period? Does that have a negative impact on their hourly wages that they wouldn't be able to, they would then be in violation of those laws. Maybe not as impactful for government, but a number of businesses need to look at, are employees working remotely from another state? Did I up and move to South Carolina to work remotely? So, you know, if that is the case, there may be different tax implications for employees working out of there. We need to add those to our payroll registers and determine what taxes need to be deducted and the like. So, and finally, even if we take it outside of the context of just working because it's more convenient, if you have employees who have disabilities who need remote work, it's going to become more and more likely that this is a reasonable accommodation for them to be able to do it, especially if we're allowing employees without disabilities to be able to do it. And there may be some costs associated with helping them put home offices and things of that nature together to ensure that they're able to operate within those confines. So this becomes part of the interactive process. There may be a cost that's associated with it, but ensuring that we're in compliance with our disability rights and obligations is always a major concern. Even before we started doing this, I had some cases where we were trying to determine when and if remote work is necessarily a reasonable accommodation for certain areas. I think it will become more and more so now that this is becoming even more of a common practice within the governmental and private sector. So I know we covered a lot of material, but I would say probably the most important items for takeaways on it is, looking at what is our equipment cost, objective measures for employees to ensure productivity doesn't go down, and making sure we're getting the wage and hour correct, and people are being paid for hours actually worked, and the like. So if you have any questions, I'm happy to try and answer them.
Okay, looking for questions. There are some comments, but there one question here from Charles Daniel. Is a municipality legally required to allow an employee who has school-aged children that have not returned to school because of COVID school closing to work from home to take care of their children's remote schooling needs? Popular question.
So that falls into some of the laws that were passed at the end of March, and there was an expansion of the Family Medical Leave Act to allow for leave for childcare. So the Family Medical Leave provides for 12 weeks of unpaid leave. However, this adjustment did say that you need to pay the employees for 2/3 of their salary during that 12-week period. If the employee has exhausted the 12 weeks of FMLA, the obligation to allow them to work from home and the obligation to pay them could go away. That's going to end up being driven a lot by internal policy, and there's not necessarily going to be state or federal law that puts a specific mandate on it. But I do think that there's going to be a component of figuring out what are we doing for other people and within the office, and how are we applying our policies to it. But a lot of people had already exhausted the 12 weeks before we started reopening schools. So they may have already run out of that based upon that April, May, June time period they're caring for their children.
Okay. Dave Miller wants to know if you have any comments on workers' comp eligibility.
Yeah, so I don't do workers' comp, but I have wondered about this. If somebody gets injured in their home office while they're performing work for the entity, would that be a valid workers' comp claim? I believe there are some cases where those are compensable claims. And so when the entity is allowing people to work from home, they may want to do a survey of the individual's workspace to ensure that that they're appropriate for the work, and make sure that they're safe. So I'm not saying that we go in and inspect every one of them, but asking the employee to take some pictures of the work area they're going to be in on a regular basis so that we have that documented may be useful, and may be useful if any workers' comp claim comes in. If an employee does get injured for some reason while working from home, I would recommend putting in a workers' comp claim and let the comp carrier figure that out.
Okay, that's all the questions we have. We have 191 participants. Let's see if we can keep them on for about 1 minute while I make a closing statement. So first of all, thank you for Jim for an excellent presentation. As with the rest of the sessions, very relevant and informative. Most of all, I want to thank Mike Martin, the chairman of the conference committee, and the entire committee for putting on a great session. Not sure how many are aware, but those on the committee are pretty much responsible to put at least a session in the agenda each. So, we don't have any individual person putting this together. It is a real group effort, and that gives us a lot of variety in the sessions we have. Of course, this year was very, very focused on the current state of the economy and pandemic and everything else, remote computing, and as this last session was kind of the theme. So I thank everybody, all attendees. It's for your participation. We've got record numbers for Friday's session, which is awesome. So that of course, I need to also thank John Donadio and his staff for always doing a wonderful job, especially the staff. So I thank everyone and see you later.
Thank you.